The winter of 1896 found Philadelphia shivering under a gray sky. The streets were slick with slush and coal smoke hung low in the air, clinging to the brick buildings like a bad habit. Down near the wharves, where the factories hummed and the world's noise never stopped, a young man played his fiddle for anyone who'd listen. Henry Callahan, 24, son of a dock worker and a seamstress, played like the world might end tomorrow. He wasn't famous, but folks knew him. The thin fellow with the sharp blue eyes and the fiddle that could make even the toughest man pause. When the nights were long and the taverns full, Henry's music kept the crowd from fighting. And sometimes, if the whiskey was good, they'd toss a few coins his way. But in a city of steel and smoke, dreams didn't stretch far. Every day, Henry watched men come and go from the train yards, faces smudged with soot, voices full of talk about gold. They spoke of the Klondike, a wild northern land where rivers ran yellow and fortunes were waiting for any man brave enough to freeze for them. At first, Henry laughed. He had no shovel, no claim, no map. What business did a fiddler have chasing gold? But then came the night that changed him. It was in O'Malley's Tavern, a narrow room full of smoke and bad lighting. Henry was halfway through a song when a man slammed a newspaper down on the bar. "Gold in the Yukon!" he barked, the headline smeared but bright enough to set half the room on fire. Within days, men were selling their houses, pawning their tools, saying goodbye to wives they'd never see again. Henry tried to ignore it, but the words burned through him like a fever. The city had always been too small for him, too loud, too closed. The thought of open sky and untouched land, of carving out a life that mattered, began to gnaw at him. He didn't want to die in Philadelphia, another poor musician forgotten by morning. He pawned his coat, sold his mother's old silver locket, and bought a one-way train ticket to Seattle, the gateway to the Klondike. His fiddle was the only thing he refused to part with. "You'll be my luck," he said quietly, packing it into its worn case. As the train pulled from the station, Henry watched the chimneys and rooftops fade behind him. Ahead lay the unknown, cold, rough, and full of promise. He wasn't chasing gold, not yet. He was chasing a chance. And as the rails stretched north beneath the winter moon, Henry Callahan's fiddle rested on his knees, silent for now, but ready. By the time Henry Callahan reached Dawson City, the summer sun barely dipped below the horizon. The gold rush had turned the once silent wilderness into a roaring circus. Tents, saloons, and trading posts sprawled across the muddy riverbanks like mushrooms after rain. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the sound of men dreaming out loud. Henry stepped off the steamer with a fiddle case in one hand and a small canvas pack slung over his shoulder. His boots sank ankle-deep in mud before he'd even taken 10 steps. Around him, fortune seekers shouted over the din, bartering for sled dogs, whiskey, and shovels. A preacher was shouting about sin near the boardwalk, while two men fought in the street over a claim that probably didn't exist. It was chaos, and Henry felt oddly at home. He found his way into the Lucky Nugget, a ramshackle saloon whose piano had long since gone out of tune. The smell of tobacco and pine whiskey hit him like a wave. Rough men crowded the tables, prospectors, gamblers, and drifters, their faces burned by wind and greed. "Play something, boy," barked the bartender, a broad man with a beard like a snowdrift. Henry hesitated, then lifted his fiddle. The room fell quiet, save for the crackle of the stove. His bow touched the strings, and the first notes rose. Slow, haunting, something between a prayer and a memory. It wasn't long before the mood shifted. A few men nodded, someone hummed along. Then, like a spark catching kindling, the crowd began to soften. When he finished, a prospector threw a gold nugget onto the floorboards. "Play another!" he shouted. By the end of the night, Henry's hat was full of coins. He'd earned more than he'd made in a week back in Philadelphia. But more than that, he'd earned attention. But what caught his ear wasn't applause. It was the voice of an old man, half hidden by shadows at the end of the bar. He was thin, gray-bearded, with a face creased like old leather. His name, someone said, was Jacob. Once a prospector, now just another soul drowning in whiskey. He talked loud, the way lonely men do, and most nights his words drew only laughter. "There's a creek," Jacob slurred, "up past the Stewart River. Gold there like you've never seen, thick as autumn leaves, lying right in the water. But you'll all die chasing it if you're fool enough to try." The room roared with laughter. One man clapped him on the shoulder. "Go on, old man. If it's true, why ain't you rich?" Jacob just looked down at his drink and muttered, "Too late for me now." Henry said nothing, but something in the old man's tone, the way his voice cracked on that last line, tugged at him. Later that night, while the others gambled and sang, Henry played a quiet tune by the fire. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Jacob alone, whispering to himself, tracing a rough shape on the table with a shaking finger. A line like a river, a small X near its bend. Henry's fingers hesitated on the strings. Maybe it was just the whiskey talking, or maybe, just maybe, he'd heard the first true note of a hidden fortune. Henry Callahan spent the next few nights in the Lucky Nugget, not just playing music, but listening. Dawson City was full of noise. Boots on floorboards, arguments over claims, bad piano notes, the clink of whiskey glasses. But between all that chaos were the things Henry cared about most. The things men said when they'd had just enough drink to grow careless. And every night, Jacob was there. At first glance, Jacob looked like any other prospector whose dreams had been drowned in whiskey. Most men ignored him, some mocked him, but none listened. Henry, though. Henry watched him carefully. The old man wasn't raving nonsense. Not entirely. His words had structure, rhythm, and detail no liar ever bothered with. "River splits twice," Jacob muttered one night, head down over his drink. "Second branch runs north, past a stand of dead spruce. Follow it till the water turns clear as glass. Then you'll see it. The golden bin nobody paid him any mind." A few men snorted into their cups. One shoved him off his stool. Jacob didn't fight back. He just settled onto the floor, still talking to himself, fingers moving across the boards, like he was tracing something only he could see. Henry leaned forward from his corner. Bow paused midair. Something gnawed at him. The old man's words weren't drunken rambling. They were directions. The next night, Henry played longer than usual. Wild tunes, bright tunes, the kind that made men slap tables and toss nuggets out of pure joy. He earned enough gold dust to live on for a week, but he wasn't thinking about money anymore. He was watching Jacob. The old man drank alone, staring into the firelight like it held the ghosts of every mistake he'd ever made. When the saloon crowd grew rowdier, Henry slipped away from the corner, his fiddle still in hand, and sat a few seats down from him. Jacob didn't look up, but his voice cracked into the space between them. "You hear 'em laugh," he murmured, "but they don't know." They didn't see it. Henry kept his tone light. "See what?" The old man swallowed hard, eyes glassy. The gold. Enough to shame every claim in Dawson. His voice dropped to a whisper. But I was too old. Too slow. Winter got me first. Broke my hands. Broke my spirit. Henry studied him quietly. If you found such a place, why don't you show someone? Partner with a man who could handle the trail? Jacob laughed, a sad, hollow thing. Tried that. Twice. Both ran off with what little I marked on a map. Never came back. Maybe they died. Maybe they struck it rich and kept it for themselves. That's the North for you. A long silence stretched between them. Then, in a shaky motion, Jacob reached into his coat and pulled out a small scrap of canvas. Faded, torn, stained with age. He laid it on the table. On it were simple marks. A river line, 2 forks, a rough circle where the water bent. Not a full map, just a hint, but a powerful one. Jacob tapped it with a trembling finger. No one believes me. But I wasn't lying. Henry's heart pounded. The music, the laughter, the smoke, all of it faded behind him. He saw the path. He saw the possibility. And for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, he felt the spark of destiny catch fire inside him. As Jacob stumbled out into the night, Henry stayed back, staring at the scrap like it was the first true fortune he'd ever held. Maybe it was madness. Or maybe he'd just heard the truth no one else had ears for. Henry Callahan didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in the cramped loft above the Lucky Nugget, listening to drunken shouts below and feeling the weight of Jacob's canvas scrap in his pocket. The map, if it could even be called that, was crude, incomplete, and worn nearly smooth by time. But it held something stronger than ink. Conviction. Jacob had spoken with the kind of certainty a liar could never fake. The old man wasn't trying to trick anyone. He wasn't trying to sell a claim. He wasn't boasting or bragging. He was remembering. And that stuck with Henry. When dawn bled through the frost-covered window, Henry made his choice. He packed his fiddle, his coat, and every coin he'd earned. If the North demanded a gamble, then he'd lay his cards clean on the table. He headed to the trading post, where a thin man with a crooked mustache sold gear to half-broken prospectors. "Need supplies," Henry said. The man gave him a long, doubtful stare. "You going out there alone?" Henry nodded. "Then buy yourself a coffin while you're at it." Henry cracked a small smile. "I'll take my chances." He bought flour, beans, salt pork, a tin pot, a bedroll, matches, and a second-hand rifle, whose barrel wasn't quite straight, but still serviceable for wolves. With the last of his gold dust, he rented a sled and an old, stubborn mule named Jasper, who looked like he'd rather die than take another step. But he moved, grudgingly. So that was enough. Before leaving town, Henry played his fiddle one last time in the saloon. Not for gold, not for tips, for courage. The men cheered, clapping tankards and boots. But as Henry packed up, he felt eyes on him. Miners weren't fools. They'd seen men stock up and head north before. A few had noticed him watching Jacob. Some probably guessed he had a lead. Greed moved fast in the Klondike. Henry pulled his coat tighter and slipped out into the pale light. The whole town seemed to watch him as he guided Jasper into the wilderness. 2 miles out, he stopped beside the frozen river and looked back. Dawson City lay behind him like a fever dream, smoke rising in thin spirals, the distant sound of laughter, the promise of easy whiskey and easy ruin. Ahead was silence, snow, fear, possibility. He pulled out Jacob's scrap. The lines were faint, but the direction was clear enough. Follow the main river north until it forked twice. Beyond the second fork, lay the bend where the old man claimed gold lay untouched. He took a breath so cold it burned. Then he whispered to himself, failure or fortune, but no turning back. And with that, Henry Callahan, fiddler, dreamer, nobody from Philadelphia, pointed his mule into the wild and began the long trek toward a legend no one else believed. When Henry left Dawson that morning, the frost cracked beneath his boots like brittle glass. The only map he had was the old man's wrinkled scrap and a handful of coordinates scrawled in pencil. He didn't tell a soul where he was going. In the Klondike, rumors traveled faster than sled dogs, and the last thing Henry needed was company. The trail north was brutal. The land rose and fell in endless ridges of white. The air so cold it burned the lungs. Snow buried the world, and the silence pressed down heavy. At night, he built small fires, played a few quiet notes on his fiddle, and thought about Jacob. The old man's slurred voice still echoing in his mind, gold thick as leaves in autumn. For a week, he followed the bends of the Stewart River, crossing ice bridges and frozen creeks until the land grew strange, untouched. The map led him through narrow valleys and thick pine stands until, on the 8th day, he found it. At first it was nothing, just another frozen stream twisting between cliffs. But when he broke the ice with his pick and scooped the gravel beneath, his heart nearly stopped. There it was, gold. Thick flakes, rough and heavy, lying in the pan, like sunlight caught in his hands. He laughed, loud and wild, his breath rising in clouds. The sound of his fiddle filled the valley moments later, a triumphant tune that rolled through the still air like a celebration. For 3 days, Henry worked alone, staking his claim with trembling hands. When he returned to Dawson, the frost still in his beard, he went straight to the mining office and registered it quietly. Callahan's Creek men laughed when they heard. Another drunk's dream, one said. He probably found fool's gold. But Henry didn't argue. He just smiled and ordered a whiskey. That night, he played at the Lucky Nugget again. His fiddle sang higher than ever, and the old-timers swore they heard something new in his music. A spark of truth. When Henry Callahan returned to his claim, the north was just beginning to thaw. The river cracked and groaned beneath the ice, the air thick with the scent of wet pine and earth. It was the sound of the world waking up. And to Henry, it sounded like a promise. He built a small cabin by the water, little more than a roof and 4 walls, and set to work day after day. He panned and shoveled, the rhythm of his labor steady as a metronome. His hands bled, his back ached, but every pan glittered with gold. Not dust, flakes, nuggets, chunks the size of beans. By the end of the first month, he had enough to make any man in Dawson rich. But Henry didn't rush back. He wanted more than a lucky strike. He wanted proof, a fortune no one could laugh at. When the snow began to melt faster, word reached town that the Fiddler's Creek had real gold. At first, no one believed it. Then one prospector, then another, went looking and returned wide-eyed. Callahan's found it, one said in the saloon. That fool musician's sitting on a mountain of it. Within a week, men were begging to work for him. Henry, remembering how the old man had been dismissed and mocked, chose carefully. He hired 4 men, steady workers, not drunks, and together they built sluices, dug deeper, and found more. By midsummer, Callahan's Creek was roaring with activity. Wooden pans clattered, shovels rang, and the strongbox grew heavier each night. Henry's leadership was quiet but firm. He paid fair wages, demanded honesty, and every evening When the day's work was done, he'd pull out his fiddle and play. The men said the music kept them sane, that the creek itself seemed to hum along when he played. They called it the singing claim. Once, while resting by the fire, one of his men asked, "What'll you do with it all, Henry?" "The gold, I mean." Henry smiled faintly. "Maybe I'll build something back home," he said. "Something that lasts. Something that gives a man a fair chance." The others chuckled, thinking it a joke, but Henry wasn't smiling long. He'd seen too many men ruined by greed, too many gamblers and drunkards chasing dust until nothing was left. He didn't want to end that way. By autumn, Callahan's Creek had become the richest small claim in the region. Prospectors came to see it, investors sent offers, and Henry turned them all down. He didn't come for fame. He came for freedom. One evening, standing by the fire, he took the last nugget of the day and dropped it into the strongbox. "For you, Jacob," he whispered. Then he lifted his fiddle and played, a slow, bright tune that drifted through the valley, echoing against the cliffs. To those who heard it, it sounded like joy. To Henry, it sounded like peace. Henry often thought of old Jacob, the man with whiskey on his breath and truth in his voice. Sometimes, when the wind whistled through the pines, Henry could almost hear him laughing from some far ridge, saying, "Told you so, boy." He never found Jacob again, not in Dawson, not on any trail. Maybe the old man had gone home, or maybe the Yukon had taken him. But Henry carried his memory like gold dust, proof that wisdom can come from the most forgotten souls. When Henry stepped off the train in Philadelphia, the air felt thick, heavy with coal smoke, and noise instead of frost and silence. The clang of streetcars, the bark of newsboys, the smell of bread and soot. It was a far cry from the clean cold of Dawson. He carried only one trunk. The rest, the sleds, the picks, the tools, he'd left behind in the north. Inside the trunk were two things: his fiddle and a pouch of gold dust he hadn't sold. Not for wealth, but for memory. People stared as he walked through the old neighborhoods. Once he had played on these corners for coins. Now, men in hats tipped to him, and bankers asked his name. The city that had ignored him before suddenly seemed eager to listen. But Henry wasn't interested in fame. He'd learned that gold could buy comfort, not peace. Instead, he rented a small office near Market Street and opened a modest bank for prospectors and working men. A place where no one would be cheated for lack of fancy words or clean shoes. He named it the Northern Trust of Philadelphia. Word spread quickly. The papers printed stories of the fiddler of Dawson City, the man who found fortune by listening to an old drunk reporters asked him for interviews. Society women wanted to meet him. Henry obliged politely, but his heart stayed quiet. Some nights after closing the bank, he'd sit by the window with his fiddle and play the old tunes, the same ones he played for whiskey in Dawson saloons. But now, each note carried the sound of wind over frozen valleys and the memory of a man named Jacob, who no one had believed. One evening, a young boy stopped outside his window, listening. Henry smiled and opened the door. "Do you play?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "No, sir, but I'd like to." Henry handed him the fiddle, gently. "Then start now. Never wait for someone to tell you you're good enough." The boy grinned, awkwardly scratching out a tune. For the first time in a long while, Henry laughed. That night, as the lamps dimmed and the city murmured outside, Henry realized something simple and true. Gold fades, but the song stays. He closed the window, looked toward the stars that hung over the rooftops and whispered, "For you, Jacob." And somewhere far to the north, where the Yukon winds still howled through empty valleys, maybe an old man's spirit smiled back. By the spring of 1901, Henry Callahan's name had become something of a legend around Philadelphia. But unlike the gaudy tales told in saloons, his story wasn't one of reckless fortune or wild spending. It was a tale of steady hands and quiet purpose. At the Northern Trust, miners, dockhands, and small business owners lined up to deposit their hard-earned wages. Some came in nervously, still half expecting to be swindled. But Henry greeted each man the same way, with a smile, a handshake, and a fiddle resting behind the counter like an old friend. He wasn't the sort of banker who hid behind ledgers. He'd listen to every story, from the man who lost his claim to the woman saving for her son's schooling. He'd say, "There's gold in good work, too. Don't forget that." As the months rolled on, Henry began sponsoring small ventures. A wagon repair shop, a blacksmith, a bakery. He wasn't chasing profit. He was investing in people. He remembered too well what it felt like to have no one believe in you. One evening, after closing time, the same boy who had once stopped to hear him play returned, a fiddle case under his arm. "Mr. Callahan," he said proudly, "I've been practicing. Would you play with me?" Henry smiled and drew his bow across the strings. Together, their notes filled the room, rough and unsteady at first, then blending into something hopeful. A simple tune, but it carried warmth, like a fire burning against the cold memory of Dawson's winds. Afterward, the boy asked, "Do you miss it, sir? The gold fields, the adventure?" Henry thought for a long moment before answering. "I miss the sky," he said finally, "and the silence between the storms. But adventure doesn't end when you come home. It just changes shape." The boy nodded, though he didn't quite understand. Years later, when people spoke of Henry Callahan, they didn't just speak of the fiddler who struck gold. They spoke of the man who gave others a chance, who turned the lessons of the Klondike into a life built on trust, kindness, and courage. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings, a faint strain of fiddle music could still be heard drifting out of his bank window, mingling with the hum of the waking city. The song of a man who had traded gold for grace. Years passed, and the bustle of Philadelphia grew louder. Electric lights replaced gas lamps, and the rattle of trolleys filled the streets. But inside Henry Callahan's modest bank, time seemed to move differently. The walls were lined with old maps of the Yukon, the faint smell of pine oil still clinging to the floorboards. And in the corner sat that same fiddle, resting like an old companion. Henry was older now, his hair touched with silver, his hands rougher than most bankers. But when he picked up the fiddle, the years seemed to fade. The bow still danced, and the notes still carried that strange northern wind through the heart of the city. One afternoon, a reporter from the Philadelphia Gazette visited to write a piece about the fiddler who became a banker. "Mr. Callahan," the young man asked, notebook in hand, "do you ever think you just got lucky?" Henry smiled. "Luck is finding a nugget," he said, "but keeping it. That takes grit. Life's the same way. You don't wait for fortune to find you. You play your tune until the world starts listening." The reporter scribbled the words down, unaware they'd echo long after Henry was gone. That night, Henry sat by the window as dusk rolled over the city. He tuned his fiddle and began to play. Not for the crowds, not for money, but for the journey itself. Each note carried a piece of his life, The hunger, the cold, the laughter, and the endless hope that had driven him north so long ago. When the song ended, he looked toward the sky, where the first stars were shining faintly through the haze. Somewhere up there, in the great silence of the Yukon, he imagined old Jacob listening. "Thank you, old friend," Henry whispered, "for believing, even when no one else did." He set the fiddle down and leaned back, feeling the peace that only comes to a man who's lived his dream all the way through. In time, the bank grew, the boy became a musician, and the people Henry helped carried his name with quiet pride. But Henry Callahan's true fortune wasn't locked in a vault. It lived on in every person who refused to give up, who took a chance when the world said no. Because in the end, Henry had learned the greatest truth of all. Success isn't about striking gold. It's about striking courage. And when you find that, you never have to chase anything again.